Hi there and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. My name is Adrian Goldberg. This time from Murdoch to Musk, mapping changes in our media landscape, with the Byline Times co-founder Peter Jukes and Byline Times editor Hardeep Matharu. This was recorded recently on the Byline Times live channel, which you can follow on YouTube. It's a story which takes in the recent US presidential election, attended by the tech bros, Elon Musk from X, the Meta boss Mark Zuckerberg and Amazon's Jeff Bezos, but which goes back to the influence wielded by Australian-American press baron Rupert Murdoch, owner of The Sun, The Times and, at one time, The News of the World. Peter picks up the story with the recent phone hacking court battle between Murdoch's news group newspapers and both Prince Harry and the Labour peer, Lord Tom Watson.
So the important thing about this trial that didn't happen, as the settlement happened just as they opened the trial, is that back in 2011, when they closed News of the World, news group newspapers used to be called News International, the parent company. The bigger parent company is News Corp, which is Murdoch's overall company, admitted there had been systematic phone hacking at the News of the World and closed it. That was after 5 years covering it up, because what happened is we now know they were doing extensively going back to the late 90s and other forms of unlawful information gathering, which are more lurid and dangerous and fascinating than even phone hacking. But back in 2006, the royal correspondent called Clive Goodman and Glenn Mulcair, this private investigator, were both arrested because they'd been extensively hacking the phones of the royal princes, as they were, Harry and William. And the anti-terrorist branch cleverly caught them out by putting in some false information, then realized it was a voicemail. At that time, even though it was done on an industrial scale and not just at News of the World, obviously now the Sun admitting, and we'll get to their admissions later, but the Mirror Group and other newspapers, this was a standard mode of operation. They tried to close it down. In fact, when the police arrived, they were sort of bullied off the premises by burly security guards. And what the News of the World claimed was journalistic exemption. You can't arrest journalists. So what they did was they prosecuted Goodman and Mulcair, and they said there's one rogue reporter. The problem was, and this is the big cover-up, the police managed to take from Glenn Mulcair's offices a whole bag of targets and books, and there's about 3,000 targets there.
Wow.
And the police kind of knew this, and they went along with News of the World and Murdoch's line, and Rebecca Brooks, still chief executive, line. It was one rogue reporter. And it was only, particularly Sienna Miller and Graham Taylor, that people suspected they'd been hacked. They began slowly dripping civil legal claims for privacy intrusion. From 2006 onward, the big one was 2009, Sienna Miller. And they got some disclosure that it was more extensive. The crucial thing at this point, James Murdoch had taken over News International, which is Murdoch's second oldest son, and they wanted to merge with Sky. That time, Rupert Murdoch owned only 30% of Sky, but wanted to take over the whole thing. So they're desperate to this deal, which the Cameron government had green-lit, desperate to hide these bodies from the press side.
Not real bodies,
Not
just
really.
to clarify,
Well,
Peter.
There is a real body in this, and that's Daniel Morgan, but we maybe get to that later. Behind these, they describe them as bodies under the floorboards, and James Murdoch walked into this, right? 2008 takes, and let's clear up any past misdemeanors, and all this information starts coming out. So they're desperate to clamp it down. Meanwhile, Nick Davis, who's spoken to private investigators, spoken to journalists, knows that it's rife. The weird thing is the police would do nothing about it. So it went down this civil route. I think the first phone hacking story by Nick was about 2009. Nothing happened. 2010, the New York Times, because nobody, the Omerta, Preston Omerta, nobody had covered here.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. So New York Times covered it.
The only way that
2010.
what happened was, and I wonder what it was about, phone hacking, it doesn't seem that big, but the rest of the press buried it for good reason. They're all part of the same press council, what was it called then, the regulator. They all didn't want to launder each other's dirty linen in public. So they had to go to America. Still nothing. But every time more people came forward, a lot of whistleblowers, and every time you can see, partly run by Will Lewis, who's now at the Washington Post, news core getting more and more panicked about this with Scupper, this major deal to take over Sky. And it's like two electrical cables coming closer and closer and closer, then trying to clamp it down. Nick Davis and now other journalists like Peter Oborne, even some good Telegraph journalists on the case of, hold on, there's not just a few victims involved.
Even some Telegraph.
The Telegraph were really good in those days, actually. They were very good on phone hacking.
So that's really interesting to see how that's shifted as well.
That's completely shifted. And there are thousands of victims, right? And what happened is they realized Keir Starmer, he was Sir Keir maybe then, changed the law because this whole thing about voicemail interception, did it count for voicemail messages if they'd been heard? A very technical legal thing. And he said, it did count. And that
so he was the director of public prosecutions at the time.
Exactly. And he changed the interpretation of the law, effectively. And so they started Operation Wheating, led by Sue Akers, the Metropolitan Police, finally forced them. Why they didn't do anything, there's a whole story with Leveson 2, which is about to be the relationship between police and the press, because a lot of the senior officers who could have done something about it were either close to Rebecca Brooks or had jobs on News of the World or at the time.
So this was the Leveson inquiry, which was launched after the phone hacking
That's right.
scandal was exposed and looked at the culture and the ethics of the press. But this second part of the inquiry that never took place was really key because, as you say, it's the relationship between the police and the press.
And they were very, very close. I mean, especially Scotland Yard and News Corps, or News International as it was then. The Sun sponsored these bravery awards. Rebecca Brooks was constantly partying with the Met Commissioner, John Stevens was. When she was arrested, she was in Wheating. She was eventually arrested in July 2011. According to, I put this in the public domain, so I'm not going to sue for it. According to a police officer present, she thought she was just turning up for an interview, and it turned out to be an interview under course. She was so furious, Rebecca Brooks slammed down a copy of Sir John Stevens' biography, which was dedicated to her.
I find those anecdotes so staggering, just how I viscerally feel as a journalist and how distorted the power of being a journalist can be. It's just...
So just on those anecdotes,
really
obviously
awful.
It emerged about these parties where she'd go horse riding with David Cameron, go to the wedding of Gordon Brown. She was in these magical circles. And there was another famous moment when somebody asked her, let's go back to the story of phone hacking in 2011, how will this end, right? This is Alan Rusbridger, the editor of The Guardian, is going all guns for this story because nobody else will cover it. Nick Davis, his star investigative reporter, is slowly revealing more and more about what went on at News of the World, and as we now know, The Sun. Rebecca Brooks was asked how will it end. And reportedly, I wasn't there, but I trust it's been in the public domain, and she said, with Alan on his knees. So they even got the PCC, I think it was Press Complaints Council, to issue a report into these 2009-10 phone hacking, and they said they were conspiracy theories and rubbish. That's how powerful Rebecca Brooks and News Corps was in British journalism.
I think at Byline Times we point out a lot of structural issues with the established press, and we scrutinise it, which we will always continue to do. But it's also important to acknowledge really good journalism. And I have to admit, Peter, when you and I met Alan Rusbridger, who is now the editor of Prospect, but was the long-standing editor of The Guardian when the phone hacking scandal was exposed, it was a real privilege, I felt, to meet him because... to be honest, it is just so rare in public life to meet somebody whose reality lives up to the ideal and what you've heard about them. A real man of integrity, somebody who was not going to be scared into not reporting the phone hacking scandal and told us extraordinary things about the pressure that was put on him not to do so. And he didn't give in to that. And I just, such an inspiration as an editor, which I just wanted to acknowledge because we acknowledge a lot of misdemeanors in the established press. But I think Rusbridger and all the work he does at Prospect on journalism as well is to be commended. And
he pointed out to us, didn't he, in that lunch, that there's very few media outlets now covering other media. So the level of targeting that went on, I mean, it's still Nick Davis is a target of these sort of dirty tricks. I spent a lot of time with him at the trial, and he got quite paranoid about some people turning up. We know that private investigators associated with the Daniel Morgan murder, and that's another story, Southern Investigations, this very corrupt private investigation unit. We get to the role of private investigators, they are key. Were rifling through his block, got into his house. I think they were there on a security check and they relayed back to some of the bad private investigators what went on there. But he was consistently targeted, but by the establishment as well as these dirty tricks, let alone when we get to what happened to Hugh Grant or Tom Watson in terms of surveillance, theft, burglary, hacking. So we get to this point in the spring of 2011. They're about to sign the deal.
So this is the Sky.
The merger, the takeover, which they'd create this joint hub. They could see, I think, and I wrote about it in my 2012 book about Murdoch, that the papers were suffering. They needed a digital hub, right? And they're going to make this one-stop shop. Very important for them strategically that they were putting all we know from Leveson. They were lobbying hard. The culture secretary, who was Hunt, they had already been invited in by Cameron and Osborne make a deal to take Andy Coulson, who was the editor of News of the World, who goes to prison as chief of communications. And that's the reason they backed him. Rebecca Brooks had backed Tony Blair. Blair had been so close to Murdoch. He was the godfather of his children with Wendy Dang. Murdoch had supported him during the Iraq War, maybe pushed him even further, the Iraq War. We often talk about this fusion of the political media class. And in 2008, Rebecca Brooks jumped ship and supported Cameron. A lot of deals in the back room. Anyway, what Murdoch expected in return for this support was this deal to go through. And then what happened? Millie Dowler. Now, Millie Dowler was a murdered school child. And in the early noughties, News of the World would lead on murders. The Surrey murders, that was their big story. Rebecca Brooks very interested in children and what happened to them. And what emerged was that they'd hacked her phone when she disappeared. So much so, this is a bit tendentious because we're not sure of the timings, but because the voicemails had been listened to, the parents thought she was still alive. There's the Management Services Committee run by Will Lewis, Simon Greenberg, now deceased, and 4 News Corps above Rebecca Brooks, always worried that one of these phone hacking stories would go mainstream. And they thought it might be the McCann story, Madeleine McCann, the Soham story, or Millie Dowler. And they were right. Millie Dowler just went bam. It was too much for the public. They realized they couldn't maintain it anymore. News of the World was closed.
Bring us up to speed with the case that was settled.
Yeah.
So this was a case in which the claimants were Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, and the Labour peer Lord Tom Watson, who's the former deputy leader of the party. And we understood that for intents and purposes, this was going to go to trial. And huge amounts of evidence was then going to be laid out in the public domain. That didn't happen, but unprecedented that there was an apology issued to Prince Harry for unlawful news gathering that happened at The Sun at the hands of private investigators.
So that's the point, was they very quickly, when they closed News of the World, created a title called The Sun on Sunday. So I thought, we can close our Sunday, we survived this. The paper is the oldest English language newspaper in the world, but they thought they'd get away with it. But they always built this firewall. Nothing happened at The Sun. Those admissions, this has been going through the civil courts, these cases, the same evidence based on for 10 years. Murdoch has paid out over £1 billion in settlement. But they'll settle, I agreeing there's some damage here. They'll apologise but not admit no wrongdoing. Why it came so close is they do actually admit they broke the law at The Sun. It's cleverly phrased in the word. They say it's PIs, and that's what their spin of The Sun is. But actually, they admit they have broken the law, which is very interesting to where this goes. But it's very key that it's The Sun as well, because Rebecca Brooks was editor of The Sun after editing News of the World. Andy Coulson was the Bizarre Showbiz editor. Piers Morgan was the Bizarre Showbiz editor, went on to edit News of the World before he went to the Mirror Group. So they were accepting at a very high level that this was extensive across the whole business. Why it got so far is they didn't want to do that. People ask me, why didn't Prince Harry and Tom Watson go the whole hog? Well, the problem in English law is Rule 36. It's a weird thing, probably to stop too much litigation, that if you go to trial and you settle, and you say News UK and NGN is in this case, settled, and offer settlement, but you refuse it, and the judge awards you damages slightly less than the settlement, you're liable for the other side's legal costs as well as your own. Now, the damages in these cases tend to be a maximum privacy, £100,000 to £200,000. The trial costs are tens of millions, because you have all the best lawyers in England, right, working for years, witness statement, QCs, 10,000 a day. And you have huge ranks of lawyers and claimants. So there are millions and millions of pounds. And Hugh Grant settled on this basis that he even had a brilliant case against the Sun. If he didn't accept what damages they gave them, we don't know what they gave him, Hugh Grant, he would then be liable for the whole cost of the trial. That would be 10 million. So it would be 20, 30 million on hook. The other thing, and this is where we have a piece by Dan Evans, one of the first whistleblowers, was a witness of truth in the phone hacking trial, who was a journalist at News of the World, admitted to phone hacking. One of the only two, I think, voluntarily, is that in the current media landscape, the trial would not be represented fairly. We've seen like the Mirror trial. All the papers go, oh, Harry admits that's wrong. Tom Watson admits that. They'll even reinvade somebody's privacy and remind, it'll come up that they hacked the phone and the mother was suicidal or whatever. They had an affair. And the papers will reanimate that damage. So it is a trial by name. It's a trial of ordeal. To go through that, and I know Carol Cadwallader, a good friend, has been through that. It's horrific. So you both have the danger you'd be on the hook for tens of millions of pounds, and that you're going to be just parried, tarnished in newspapers all over again, because they have no duty, unlike a criminal trial, to represent it fairly. And I think the NGN, News Corp parent group, went so far they had enough admissions to maybe take it to the next stage.
Yeah, and we can't forget that the Murdoch empire also had the Dominion case, where they paid out
800 million.
Yeah, a lot of money in terms of Fox News and the presidential election that was not stolen.
So just on that term,
Trump.
so we know, if you put those two figures together, it's 2 billion they paid out in legal costs in the last 10 years. Can I just add one other point and move on to questions you might be interested in? It is important to emphasize that phone hacking was the benign side of what they did. So when you can listen to the podcast Untold, the Daniel Morgan murder, which is about a rogue private investigations firm. This original owner was murdered with involvement of corrupt police, and then for 25 years, and basically in the late 80s onwards, it became the one-stop shop for the dark arts. The dark arts, phone hacking, when one of the co-founder of Southern Investigations went into prison for fitting up a woman with cocaine in a custody dispute, a minor crime compared to what he'd done before. That's when they went to phone hacking, because suddenly they didn't have this hub of corrupt cops and surveillance experts and covert entry people and police records, and they'd hack phones, landlines, they'd get bank details, they'd bug people, they'd follow them, they'd commission burglaries. That's when they went to phone hacking, because that's Glenn Marquette, quite a nice, crazy guy, fun guy. Listening to people's voicemail messages was much cleaner than what they'd done before. Not only when Jonathan Rees, the co-founder of Southern Investigations, come out of prison, that's when they drop Glenn Marquette, and then Andy Coulson employs him again. So it is important. In Tom's case, and Hugh Grant, allegations of burglaries for commission, surveillance, tracking, landline, medical records. That's the extent any part of your private life. I was once told by a photographer, he'd turn up in those days, the heyday of the tabloids. There's somebody, Hugh and Guy, there's been Love Rat, or there's been some footballer, something. He'd meet these guys in a white van. They'd have their bank details, their credit card statements, their phone records, their medical records, and then pap them. So this is Stasi-like levels of surveillance. And we must be clear, the other allegation in Tom Watson's evidence, and he had witnesses to come forward to say this, including Chris Huhne, former business secretary, former energy secretary, Vince Cable, former business secretary, Paul Farrelly, that even while the Select Committee in Parliament was investigating phone hacking and the Leveson inquiry was going on, they were being hacked still.
So that's phone hacking. Let's talk a little bit about the evolution of the media. Because on the very day that the case was being settled, or within the few days, we had the inauguration of Donald Trump. And what I found really interesting about it was Rupert Murdoch was there. You had him sitting there before the actual swearing-in ceremony. There was a reception at the church. And it was a very interesting picture of Murdoch sitting to the side. But all the tech bros, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, they were all sitting together in a huddle much closer to the front. And of course, when he was sworn in, Donald Trump as president once again, there they all were in the photograph. Really interesting moment, almost as if Murdoch was watching on from the sides and accepting some changing of the guard was going on. This is a new world that we're in. The tech media bros, the oligarchical forces around the US government, because indeed Elon Musk is a tech bro and a member of the US government who funds Donald Trump. Really extraordinary shift that's happening. And it felt very on a symbolic level that Murdoch was acknowledging that. So we've gone from traditional newspapers to the world of social media and tech oligarchy. So let's look at how we got there. I mean, let's start with Twitter, perhaps, as it used to be called, because you had some experience of social media during the phone hacking trial. And at that point, it was a really useful tool.
Yes, I think we spoke on the previous broadcast how, as you say, and it'll be probably a headline of next edition, there's a change of the guard. The revolution was being insidious or slowly going on is now transformed in that Elon Musk earned $100 billion supporting, and how he supported Trump should be looked at. $100 billion, his share value went up over that week of the election, and News Corp is worth $16 billion. So he could buy 6 of Murdoch's companies, buy Murdoch out 6 times. So that just financially, obviously it's only share valuations, it's not necessarily exactly ready cash, shows you something that's happened. And unlike Murdoch, who'd come in the back door, or sometimes really always the back door to see Cameron or to see Theresa May, part of the process coming a British Prime Minister would be to welcome Rupert Murdoch and get his backing. Musk's in the front door, getting an office in the White House. There's no hiding it. There's no pretense that he isn't part of the government. Because we talk about it abstractly, don't we? We talk about social media, this phenomenon, this political, economic phenomenon, and how it's changing the world, and bots and automation and consensus, and how social media changes us psychologically. But talk a bit more personally about that. Because, I had a Twitter account, barely used it from about 2009 onwards, seemed to be full of a lot of people posing to me, like, oh, look where I was at. I kind of didn't feel like showing my private life in that way. But it was always, I remember when this revolution happened in Iran, or any disaster would happen, I think there are a lot of good correspondence with the journalistic media. You got on there and you go, here's a reporter. They had the storm during the riots. There was a going around filming them on his phone or taking pictures. It was a source, direct source, bypassing the mainstream media of information. And that's how I built I wasn't a journalist, and I'd just written a book about Murdoch. I turned up to just watch the beginning of the trial, and I had an iPad and a keyboard. This in 2013. And I started typing, and then suddenly my follower count kept growing. I got 15,000 one day. And I remember talking to this woman at Twitter. She called me in to give a talk to them. They thought I'd bought all these followers because nobody gets that. And I was asked to stay because I'm a dramatist. There was fewer characters back in those days. I had enough memory to type out quite memorable lines, and I was quick. And I was kind of first one to say, beat Nick Davis. Yes. Breaking, Rebecca Brooks and Andy Coulson had a years-long affair, And obviously people came to me for breaking news. And then I was asked to stay, and I said I couldn't afford it because, I can't spend all day because the trial was going to go on for months. And people said, well, crowdfund it, and I crowdfunded it overnight. So back in the day, it was an insurgent media. I mean, it could be somebody like me, very little bit of journalistic training, not like you, proper journalistic training, could find an audience and speak to people. And it was, having worked for big broadcasts like BBC and ITV, it reminded me much more of working in Fringe Theatre, touring a small show, rattling a can at the Edinburgh Festival, come in and watch our show, you get a good view, more people come in. It felt like that sort of direct connection with the audience. I loved it because, people would thank you, I'd give you a bit more money, or you got this spelling typo in your book. You crowdsource money, crowdsource information. You felt like part of a community. And out of that, Byline.com and the paper came. And we've lost that. It's a great shame, isn't it? Don't you feel that Blue Sky is slightly better? But that was a moment of freedom against the mainstream media. Now, Twitter X is a hellhole, a rolling vortex of hate misogyny and racism. I'm not having a conversation with anybody genuine on there. Occasionally, you're being targeted. You're speaking to agents, not bots, and I can explain the difference. I'm getting all these right-wing people constantly going, there's somebody that says, oh, Jukes has spoken again. Or you've had it in the past about Enoch Powell. And suddenly you don't get genuine conversation. You get targeted hatred. Hundreds of people suddenly come onto your one thing. And it's like the opposite of free speech. It's like he said there's a free speech absolutist, Elon Musk. What he's done is use the algorithm to chill us, to silence Byline Times, to terrorize people, MPs, women, people of colour from speaking out at all.
So to really look at this evolution from Murdoch to Musk, because I think arguably the newspapers had a lot of impact. And some people have said to me that we can't get away from the fact that Murdoch's influence was immense. He would set the national agenda, set the national conversation for the newspapers. We saw that for many, many years. And I think that's all really valid. No one's downplaying the reach and the influence that he had. But I think there's been a major shift because essentially what's happened is the news industry and social media platforms, which are technically two completely different things, they've effectively merged. So they're all now one ecosystem. And so I think in America, it's slightly more complex because power and the press was never merged in the US as it was in the UK. But I think for the UK, why is it that the newspapers still have the paper review? Why is it that they are still significant? Even with what we're saying that there's a real shift in how the news industry operates because of social media. Because all of these newspapers are on social media and they are very receptive to, for example, what Elon Musk is saying. They then write certain front pages. Yes, maybe the influence of Murdoch isn't so prevalent in those news front pages anymore, but this notion of this ecosystem and what is being discussed in that ecosystem, which is predominantly online now via social media, that is still generating front pages. We saw that recently with Musk's comments on the grooming gang scandal, which very much led news coverage for a whole week, the BBC, all the newspapers, and then that sets the talking points for talk radio, for GB News, for the Spectator magazine. So this ecosystem has been boosted in some ways by social media. And I also think it's quite complex because what hasn't changed in Britain is power and the press and it being very close together, especially when it comes to right-leaning newspapers and politics of the right. That connection is still very much there. That hasn't shifted. All that's happened now is it exists within an ecosystem, which includes social media and Elon Musk being the ultimate arbiter of places like X. And so it's almost amplifying the right-wing talking points. So it's really hard to say that we've gone from Murdoch to Musk. The newspapers now have no influence. They're not important. We just need to look at what's happening on social media. If you do that alone, it doesn't really make sense. It's an evolution which, there's a new platform that all of these established media outlets are now operating in. But again, it works to the favor of some and not others, I think. So certain messages are being communicated, but others are not.
Very astute, Hardeep. I mean, in a way, I do like this back to Lord of the Rings. Musk has found the one ring to control the other rings, which is especially right-wing British media. But look, here's another thing that connects it all, right? So I remember sitting on a table with Times journalists. My first journalistic work was with my early 50s, a bit later than you, was with the Daily Beast. And Tina Brown invited me to some event in the National Gallery, dinner. Something to do with Downton Abbey, which she was sponsoring. And I was on the table with all of these Times journalists. I'd just been reporting on Murdoch. It's like 2012, 13. And really, seriously, a table of like one ex-editor, I won't say their names, not very fair, but there were like 8 Times journalists. Oh, Peter, don't be so mean on Rupert. He invests in journalism. I constantly, baby. You got to admire Rupert's innovation. He keeps on paying journalists. I get it. You're being paid, And then I estimated you can buy the British intelligentsia for £10 million, right, a year, which is probably not a bad deal. You can buy whole swathes of the commentariat, writers, authors, comedians. They write for the Times. They're on your side now. What I've noticed with Musk is he is the richest man in the world, which helps, is even a lot of right-wing British patriots, Farage types, Reform Party, begging must come and overturn our government. So where the loyalty, or the key thing that's speaking here throughout these channels, from Murdoch to Musk, is money. And it is amazing the alacrity with which a British patriot will sell his soul to a foreign oligarch, Russian, South African, or American. I think the other thing about the American, what he says, and you picked up really well, and our reporter Josiah Mortimer, when he approached Tommy Robson, Stephen Yaxley Lemon for a comment, said, "We're the media now." He said, "We're the media now." That's completely in defiance of their claim just to be a platform. That's how they got away the usual regulation over a broadcast or a newspaper. Facebook, YouTube, X claim to just be platforms. They're not. They are the media. All the papers here are based around Westminster, right? You have one national centre. The papers can be distributed one day back in historically and with railroads, right? That's why we had so many newspapers in London, because you small enough country with railroads. In America, the big newspapers aren't. There's the Washington Post, we can talk about that, New York Times, Chicago Tribune, LA Times, Boston Globe. There are a lot of non-Washington-based newspapers. There's a countervailing elites. So I don't think you had a stronger oligopoly rather than some monopoly position we had here.
Yeah. It's interesting what you say about the connecting thread is money. It's power.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, journalism is completely connected to power. It's close to it. It sits beside it. I don't think people who work in the established press really want to admit that. What's really interesting is all the people who are now saying we're the media via social media or podcasts are completely being open about it. We're the media, we have the power.
Yes.
Elon Musk is a member of the US government. It's much more blatant about that relationship. But I also think it's our own industry not wanting to admit that power and status has a lot to do with being a journalist.
Completely.
And I don't think people are willing to be open about that. And so part of the story we're seeing now is we obviously have a Labour government. Yes, we have Elon Musk on X claiming that government is ruining Britain and that Keir Starmer should be disposed before the next general election. But we still have a Labour government. There's a massive challenge. Trump's election has fired a warning shot, I think, across all Liberal parties across the Atlantic. And whether things are going to actually improve in terms of Britain's public services, the cost of living, the economy, these all remain to be seen. But there has been a lot of doom and gloom narratives around the Labour government. But what's been interesting for me to observe is, I guess you'd call it our class of liberal democratic established journalists. The people who clearly see that there are concerns coming down the way, not only from Musk, the Labour government and its relationship about how it's being treated by the newspapers. It's a very, very difficult environment that it's operating in, but actually doesn't want to do anything in terms of press reform itself. And there's a lot of analysis of what's going on about Farage and the Reform Party and Musk potentially funding it. There's a lot of liberal democratic journalists who are sitting discussing this. I mean, arguably, just like we are now, Peter. But unlike a newspaper like Byline Times, they are, in my mind, not sufficiently and with urgency warning what those dark forces that now revolve around the US government could do in our own country. People are very comfortable. There's a status with being a liberal democratic journalist. And you can sit around making podcasts and giving incisive analysis. But at the end of the day, you're also part of an establishment. And therefore, your very role in that establishment means that you can't scrutinize how it is part of the problem.
It's a paradox, isn't it? Because much as I hate the insurgent right wing, far right wing involved in this, to some extent the analysis of the kind of laziness, the smugness of mainstream media has a point. The problem is, when attacking the Times, we sometimes attack the Guardian, the alternative sources of news are completely unreliable.
Absolutely.
At least you can take the Sun to court, you can take the Sun to corrections through Ipso and the Daily Mail. And in a way, what you see looming on X is much worse. But you're right. I think this is the opportunity and the disaster. And there's a whole series of institutions, not just the BBC and mainstream press, who we kind of relied on as keeping the guardrails. But where were they doing the rise of Boris Johnson and Brexit? Where were they during the COVID contracts? They turned a blind eye until small organisations like us, or Open Democracy, or the Good Law Project, or Cal Cadwalla of the Vote Leave wrongdoing, dragged them into court, dragged them to do something. And they thought their comfy status quo would work. And only now, I think, are they waking up to the dangers ahead. Just in terms of the media business, in a way, as a small insurgent deemed left-wing, though I don't think we are particularly left-wing, we're more pluralistic, they always hated us. But now if you see who Aaron Banks, the funder of Leave EU, really hates, he hates like Channel 4 News. They hate everybody. They hate the centrists. And the centrist attitude to them, I think, has been, well, ignore them, they'll go away. That was always the line with Katie Hopkins, ignore them, they go away. Or some kind of, well, we'll put Nigel Farage on Question Time. We'll give him, they'll leave us alone if we platform Tufton Street, who wants to defund the BBC. And they're in this awful situation where that system doesn't work anymore in terms of revenues, in terms of finances. Times, I think, makes money, the Sun doesn't. Telegraph is probably worth nothing. We have a small brand which breaks even. And these people are both looking over their shoulders economically. Where is the money? Is it on YouTube influencers? Do I gravitate, as we've known journalists do? I can make, on a Substack or YouTube, I mean, much more money than newspapers. Do they kowtow to them? And I think you hit it really on the head. You talk more about that, is the power. Because, just tell me, Hardeep, I tell people I'm a dramatist. Oh, well, that's interesting. What do you write? If you tell somebody you're a journalist, they completely change, don't they?
Well, how do you mean?
Well, when you tell somebody you're a journalist, they kind of freeze up. Or they want to talk, what are you working on?
I see,
You have a power.
You have a power, yeah.
It's like a magic
but
power.
I've always felt it's such a privilege to do this job. I've said it so many times in the 6 years I've edited Byline Times. I do not understand how anyone who has the privilege of a platform where you get to speak to people like we are now, you get to play some small role in interpreting what is happening around us and connecting to these big, big shifts in our society. I do not understand how that can be seen in any way but an utter privilege. And I honestly think this is a massive problem in journalism. I don't think there's enough humility. I think there's a good dose of narcissism. I think social media has made that all worse. Let's admit it. We all have our brands. We have our own truth-telling brand as well, Peter. But we've all become these little mini icons in our own lives. But that is like the opposite of what journalism is meant to be about. And I've always been clear, it's not about us. If we represent something that is looked upon with integrity, I welcome that, but it's not about us. We're trying to help people make sense of what's going on in the world. But I think we do that from outside of the system, and that's our integrity to do that. But yeah, I think there could be a lot more humility in journalism. It has now become about the journalists. So when that happens, of course, you've got new forces on the right saying it's about us and we're the media, because they're just using the same model that the journalists become the proponents, and now the journalists are giving way to the influencers and the podcasters, which is really interesting.
Yeah, you're right. That is the fascinating phenomenon. So what the internet did and does to a newspaper is disaggregate it. You can get your crosswords separately, you get your small ads separately, your book reviews, your travel reviews. Everything that used to be aggregated in newspapers now done endless different sites, and it disaggregates journalism. So, people I quite admire, like Aaron Jones, Carol's now got her Substack, Mehdi Hassan. It does push us into this individualized influencer role. People become figureheads. And I think that is the phenomenon of this age, that it's the hero as journalist, as being something slightly different. So obviously you dealt with it responsibly, it's the story. But even if you're not the story, when you ring somebody working on a local paper and they talk to you, right? They're on the record, right? You've told me many stories of this. And then, but you put that in the paper.
Yeah,
yes.
You write it. Quota's remorse.
Quota's remorse. And I agree it's a great privilege, but it is a power. It's a superpower that you can go talk to somebody and radically alter that. You could have a life altering if you publish something. I've been on the receiving end of it once or twice when I was a dramatist. It's quite scary. Somebody can get you in the news. And I wonder if there's a lot of resentment because of that. A lot of this is anger playing out, reaction to years of, and whether once they realize they've got this power in a way which they always wanted, they might begin to wake up to the responsibilities of it.
Well, yeah, but also the power that they have is to activate each individual. That's what I find really interesting about it, because there's a difference, isn't there? So going back to Murdoch and his influence on the newspapers, for example, in this country. So the front pages may have been set by his agenda. The national conversation may have been influenced by certain stances that Murdoch favoured. So I guess what would the influence be there? It would be living in a country where you see the front pages and you're aware of roughly what's going on in politics, but there's no smartphones. So you go about your life and you watch the BBC. There are a limited number of television channels. You might listen to the radio. And that's how you know what's going on in public discourse. Now it's penetrated how we're thinking and feeling via social media. And so it's really interesting. It's not even about setting national conversations. It's about creating billions of small, personalized, targeted conversations, which change how people are even viewing the world. And I think that's the real difference. Whereas Murdoch on any given issue could go through the back door of Downing Street and say, well, I favour this, I don't like that, I'm not keen on the EU, maybe you should take that line on that story. Now, everyone's got their own stories. How they're being empowered is to create millions of their own stories. It's not so much the power is, here is what you should think about this in a uniform way. It's think what you want. Think what you want. Truth is just your truth. Everyone's got their own truth. It's about your identity. It's about image creation. It's about assertion and finding a place in society, but it's all up for grabs. And I think that is very difficult to tackle. That's the power they've given people. It's a power that they bestow on each individual to create the story that they want. It's not so much even saying, here is the story you should believe.
So, yes, those individualized, tailored realities we live in, which stop collective power. Because you just made me brainwave, which is the story of the trajectory from Murdoch to Musk, right? From dusk till dawn, as we might have it. So, if you look back, you're dead right. Murdoch's main audience, whether it was the Times, the Sun really is where he's put his most explicit agenda on that front page, or News of the World. In the early days, it might have been the readership, because he made lots of money of it. But eventually, especially by the 90s, that's declining. And what they're looking at is regulation to change and get the other deals. Their main audience was politicians. Politicians. And if you look at phone hacking and you look at the riots of meetings with senior police officers, Rebecca Brooks' weddings, and the explosion of Gordon Brown losing a child, Sherry Blair, all these stories about the politicians goes back to two classic cases, by the way, just to amplify where this all begins. I think it's 1991, 92. David Mellor is the cultural secretary, and there's been this horrible intrusion into Russell Grant. The TV presenter was dying of AIDS in hospital, and they got a picture of him, and it was so shocking. The cultural secretary said they're drinking in the Last Chance Saloon, right? Within weeks, Southern Investigations, listen to the podcast, was targeted him and caught him, bugged an apartment as having an affair, and he was essentially ousted. Paddy Ashdown, 1992, threatening to do a deal with John Smith. A letter is burgled from his solicitor, and he's having an affair, front page of The Sun, Paddy Panstad. So it's an information operation in that classic
on politicians,
because that's how you control your business. That's how you control politics. You lobby Tony Blair about the Iraq War. Every one of Murdoch's papers, except one, urged intervention, the invasion of Iraq, right? Social media changes. You don't need to do the politicians. You do the public, each individual one.
Like genuinely, in a way that Murdoch could only ever claim that his front pages influence the public in an abstract way. Now you can literally target people online. It's really interesting because this argument is often made to us. And I was on the BBC Media Show a couple of years ago with the then Spectator editor, Fraser Nelson, and I was making this point as a lone voice about the connection between the press and politicians and also the influence. And he picked up on this point of influence and he said, how can you say that we have any influence? Tens of thousands of people buy the Spectator magazine. That has absolutely no influence on what's going on in politics on a national scale in this country. And it's a very clever argument. What he's saying is members of the public, only tens of thousands are reading the Spectator. How can you say it has any impact on shaping policy? And on that point, he's quite right. But as you say, that's not the aim necessarily of what is in the Spectator. The Spectator is part of a wider wider ecosystem, which is on the right of politics. It influences what is discussed again on talk radio. It's picked up by conservative politicians and then impacts what they put on the agenda to discuss in terms of opposition politics.
More than that, Hardeep, hold it. Who was his previous editor and his current editor?
Of course, Boris Johnson. Right, and now it's Michael Gove. So it's completely intimately connected with politics. But this argument, and that's why it's really useful for us to unpick this, because on one hand, people could glance at what we're saying and it's all about Musk and the tech media barons now. It's all about social media. Well, yes and no, but yes, there's been a massive shift because you can directly reach the public now in ways that Fraser Nelson never could, because only tens of thousands of people buy his magazines. But in a way, what the shift onto social media has demonstrated is that what we already knew about the connection between power and journalism and power and information.
So the good example of that, who's the owner? You could unpack that a bit. Who's the owner of The Spectator now?
Paul Marshall.
And what else does he own?
GB News.
Yeah, and you have politicians directly paid, they're going to clamp down on that, by GB News, no left-wing ones, Reform. And where does he come from? What's the world he comes from?
He's in hedge funds, I believe, yeah.
And made a lot of money out of Brexit and other sort of political moments. So you have this convergence between money, information, and power. And I think you're dead right. I don't know if Murdoch or Musk at this point care about, when Murdoch might be now, a few extra billion. They want to be heard. I remember Rupert Murdoch came on Twitter briefly in 2013 for about a year or 6 months. And I remember he answered me. I actually replied to him. That's a great thing about Twitter, about the New York Times. And what I wrote this piece, the man who at that point owned the biggest media platform across the world, felt his voice wasn't being heard. So with the Musk, there are all these things about esteem and identity. But I think the joining part that differentiates whether it's Spectator or it's Elon Musk or Zuckerberg, they are in a will to power. Their whole thing, they're businessmen. Murdoch's more a businessman than a journalist. He does respect journalism in some ways. How do you change the world? How do you get things your way? How do you represent things? Will to power is like an information war, right? I think we're will to representation. Our job is not to gain power, but to represent the world. And that's the crucial difference between good and bad journalism, between good social media, bad social media.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because power in information is really the story of the moment, I would say, from the perspective of what we're doing. And part of that equation, power, has to be addressed. And therefore, right now, it is the job of journalists to look closely at themselves and say, well, in which ways do we maybe benefit from being close to power, whatever that is? In some way, we've seen that already with people questioning who's still on X, because it's owned by Elon Musk. And obviously it's very much gone down a very inflammatory right-wing route. The problem is that it's all very well for us to discuss this here and for an informed audience who's very interested in unpicking these topics. But going back to the public at large, I guess what we're saying is they are the targets of this information war that is now being waged solely, not through front pages of newspapers, but more directly on social media. A really interesting survey out in the last 24 hours, commissioned by Channel 4. It's due to be published in the coming days in full, which looks at Gen Z's attitudes towards politics and the media. And some quite alarming figures. More than 50% said that the UK could do without parliament and elections and needed more strong leadership. And again, more than 50% of those surveyed said that they trust, to equal amounts, if not more, the posts made on social media by their friends rather than anything from established journalists. So I guess looking at the public who are going about their lives, not like us, analysing what's happening with the media. They're just going about their lives. And I often think it's so important to get that perspective of what is it that they're taking in. And what they're taking in is politics doesn't work for us. The established media, I don't trust it, or it's all doom and gloom. There's too much of it. Social media is perhaps just more engaging way of interacting. It's more normal in their lives. The public would they even be aware that information and power and their pawns in essentially evolving revolution of tech. I don't know if they even think about it in that way, because nobody frames these issues in that way. There's no politician and very few media outlets saying we're living through a dramatic change in which information and power are connected and up for grabs.
Well, one person did his farewell statement, Joe Biden. It was a bit too late that way. And I think this is our task, isn't it? To help the readership realize what's going on. And it's a long struggle. I think it's a shame they dropped media studies. They used to mock media studies, but that critical thinking about media, and maybe those COVID injections are really bad for us, or not quite, the moon landings didn't happen, but you get grooming gangs. And whether it's, I've read it on Facebook. This is, instead of it's false. The Telegraph will have to issue a correction on page 37 3 months later. They've led the way with this disinformation. So it always brings me back to one of your favorite phrases, right? And this is what's happening. 2 young fish swimming in the sea meet an older fish, and the older fish goes to, it's a lovely day, the water's lovely, isn't it? And swims off, and the 2 younger fish go to each other, what's water? Mm-hmm. Don't even see the medium we're swimming in.
Peter Jukes with Hardeep Matharu. And if it's good, honest journalism you're after, well, look no further than the Byline Times, our wonderful monthly publication, which is edited by Hardeep and of which Peter is the executive editor, containing insightful investigations, commentary on the mainstream media and tracing the rise of tech as well. You find out how to subscribe over at our newsbreaking website, bylinetimes.com. That's bylinetimes.com. And if you take out a subscription, you will be helping to support this podcast as well. This episode of the Byline podcast has been produced in Birmingham by me, Adrian Goldberg, and Phil Driscoll. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.
Byline Audio.